Alright. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidil Anbiya'i wal Mursaleen. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin. Amma ba'd. All thanks and praise are due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And may His peace and blessings be upon His last and final messenger, His family, His companions, and those who follow them until the end of times. So alhamdulillah, last week, we were able to explore the meanings and lessons of verses 48 to 53. So inshallah tonight the plan is to explore the lessons and meanings of verses 54 to 58, and we'll start off like we do every week with reciting the verses themselves. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولوطا إذ قال لقومه أتأتون الفاحشة وأنتم تبصرون أئنكم لتأتون الرجال شهوة من دون النساء بل أنتم قوم تجهلون فما كان جواب قومه إلا أن قالوا أخرجوا آل لوط من قريتكم إنهم أناس يتطهرون فأنجيناه وأهله إلا امرأته قدرناها من الغابرين وأمطرنا عليهم مطرا فساء مطر المنذرين قل الحمد لله وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى الله خير أما يشركون. So just as a really quick reminder, the last passage of the surah, it gave us a very brief account of the story of Salih alayhi salam and Thamud. Now the surah, it transitions into the story of Lut alayhi salam and his people. And this is the fourth story mentioned in Surah al-Naml. So far we have come across the stories of Musa, Dawood, Sulaiman, and Salih alayhi salam. Now the story of Lut alayhi salam with his community, it's actually mentioned in 14 different surahs of the Quran. So in 14 different surahs across the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the story of Lut alayhi salam along with his people with varying amounts of details, with various amounts of lengths. So it's mentioned first in Surah al-An'am, followed by al-A'raf, then Hud, al-Hijr, al-Anbiya, al-Hajj, al-Shu'ara, al-Naml, al-Ankabut, al-Safat, Sad, Qaf, al-Qamar, and al-Tahrim. So the fact that this story is mentioned so many times in the Quran, and the fact that it's repeated so many times in the Quran, highlights its importance, highlights its significance, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to pay attention to this story and derive lessons and morals and reminders and guidance from it. So each surah, it mentions his story with varying lengths and details. Sometimes only a brief reference is made, and others the account is a bit longer and detailed. However, each surah mentions it in a unique way that is in line with the main themes and topics of the surah. So this is not necessarily repetition in the Quran. Whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeats something in the Quran, it's being repeated for a specific purpose. There's an intention behind it, there's some divine wisdom behind it. And every time something is repeated, or every time a narration or an account is repeated in the Quran, it's repeated within a specific context to convey different meanings, to convey different ideas. So every time the story of Lut alayhi salam is mentioned, it's mentioned within that specific context of the surah that's related to its major themes and its major topics. So what we have here in Surah al-Naml is a summarized version of his story. Specifically how his people opposed him and decided to drive him out of their town because he denounced their immoral and perverted behavior. Now Lut alayhi salam, he is the nephew of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Right? He's the actual nephew of Ibrahim alayhi salam, his brother's son. And he accepted his uncle's call to Islam, he followed his religion, and he migrated with him from Iraq to the land of Sham. So when Ibrahim alayhi salam left Iraq and he left his people, he left his family, Lut alayhi salam migrated along with him. And they ended up going to this general area known as Sham, which includes modern day Syria and Jordan and several other of the Middle Eastern countries. It's not just limited to modern day Syria. And he ended up settling in a town called Sodom. In Arabic, what they call Sadum, which was on the western shore of the Dead Sea. So geographically speaking, the town where he settled, it's on the western shore of the Dead Sea. So from this we learn that ethnically speaking or culturally speaking, he was not part of that community. Right? He was not a native member of that community. Rather, he settled there and he migrated there from Iraq. Now, when he came to this town, he found that it was full of evil. It was full of all of this immoral behavior, all of these negative practices. So its people were involved in all types of sin, vices and debauchery. It was an extremely immoral society which had no barriers. And one of the reasons for them being extremely immoral is because they lost this quality of al-haya. They lost the quality of modesty, of shamefulness, of being ashamed of their behavior, being ashamed of their actions. And the Prophet ﷺ told us in a hadith, إِذَا فَاتَكَ الْحَيَاء فَاصْنَعْ مَا شِئْتَ. That if a person loses their haya, if a person loses their modesty, then they can do as they please. Meaning they no longer have any barriers, they no longer have any inhibitions, so they can do whatever they want that's considered to be immodest or immoral, and it won't affect them, it won't have any effect upon their hearts. So for example, the people of Lut alayhi salam, they would harass travelers for no reason. So anytime visitors would come across their community, anytime where people would travel through their town, instead of welcoming them, instead of hosting them, instead of giving them food and drink and shelter, they would harass them, they would rob them, and sometimes they would even kill them. And their worst sin was this act of homosexuality. Right? The worst sin that the people were engaged in, that this people of this town were engaged in, was this act of homosexuality, which they practiced openly and unashamedly. So they literally went to the extreme in following their desires. Right? They went to the absolute extreme, the end limit of following their most basic carnal desires. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He revealed to Lut alayhi salam that he should invite his people towards belief in Allah, and that he should warn them against the consequences of their immoral and indecent behavior. That he should call them to give up their indecent way of life. So this was his mission. The mission of Lut alayhi salam was to come to this community and to reform them, by first and foremost reminding them about the existence, the oneness, the might, the power, the glory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then to remind them that once they believe in Allah, they should recognize that there are certain boundaries, there are certain limits, that there's a moral code, there's an ethical code that they should live by. So this was his mission. He was sent to the people of Sadum to bring them back towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to rectify their behavior, to rectify their attitude. But instead of listening to his message and listening to his warnings, they threatened to drive him out of the city. That if you continue to reprimand us, if you continue to try to correct us, if you continue inviting us towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are going to expel you, we are going to excommunicate you from our city. And when he continued to advise them and warn them, they eventually threatened to kill him. And this is something that we're going to see repeated throughout history. That whenever a people become extremely arrogant, whenever they become full of pride, whenever they become stubborn, then no amount of rational thought, no amount of rational argumentation affects them. They essentially resort to violence, they resort to threats, because there's no other way for them to respond. They feel cornered, they feel like they don't have anything to do, so they respond with threats of violence. And this is something that's, it's part of human nature. That whenever a human being feels cornered, whenever they're unable to respond rationally, whenever they're unable to respond with their intellect, they resort to mockery or ridicule or abuse, and even threats of physical violence. And this is exactly what the people of Sadum, or the people of Lut alayhi salam, did. So instead of listening to his warnings, they took the opposite approach. They opposed him, and they threatened to excommunicate him, and eventually they threatened to kill him as well. Now obviously, as a human being, Lut alayhi salam felt the weight of that. As a human being, he had these emotions. The response of this people caused him a lot of grief and sorrow, because he had true, genuine concern for the salvation of his people. So he continued to call them to Islam and advise them against their behavior, but it had no effect on his people's hearts. No one responded to his call and believed, except for a few members of his family. So Lut alayhi salam, he was someone who was full of genuine, sincere concern for the salvation of his people. So even though he's not a native member of this community, he's living amongst them, he's living in their town, he's benefiting from them, he's benefiting from that society, so he has concern for them. And his main concern is their salvation. That how can I, as a messenger of God, as a prophet of God, help these people achieve salvation? How can I save them from eternal punishment and hellfire? But despite his genuine, sincere concern, again, his people turned against him. And only a handful of people followed him, and even his own wife refused to accept his call. His own wife, right, the woman he was married to, refused to accept his call and continued to engage in this immoral, this indecent behavior. Now he continues calling his people towards righteousness and morality, but they still refused to believe, and they began to belittle and mock him and his message. And when it became clear that they wouldn't change their ways, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him to leave them along with his followers. And once he left this town, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completely destroyed it, literally flipping it upside down. And that was the end of the people of Sadum. Right? That was the end of the people of Lut alayhi salam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in Surah al-Naml, He introduces this narrative, this account by telling us, وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ وَأَنْتُمْ تُبْصِرُونَ. That we also sent Lut alayhi salam to his people. Right? وَلُوطًا, and remember Lut. إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ, when he said to his people, when he said to his community, أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ وَأَنْتُمْ تُبْصِرُونَ. How can you commit this outrage with your eyes wide open? أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ. Fahisha means something obscene. Something extremely, extremely obscene. So are you committing this obscene act وَأَنْتُمْ تُبْصِرُونَ, while you are looking on? Meaning while your eyes are wide open. أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ تَجْهَلُونَ. How can you lust after men instead of women? What fools you are. Now that's one of the ways that these verses have been translated. Another translation reads, and Lut alayhi salam said to his people, would you commit this abomination with your eyes open? Would you approach men with lust rather than women? You are a grossly ignorant people. Now an important thing to understand is that a translation is not the Quran. Right? The Quran is the divine, uncreated, revealed speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam through the angel Jibreel. So both the words and the meanings of the Quran are coming directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we translate this into another language, whether it's English or Farsi or Turkish or whatever language it may be, then that translation is not the Quran. It's an attempt, it's a translation of the meanings or the interpretation of the Quran. So no translation ever truly captures the essence of the Arabic language. And no translation can take the place of the actual words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the actual power, the miraculous nature of the words, the beauty, the magnificence, the eloquence can only be recognized in Arabic. And that's why when you look at translations, you will find that verses are translated differently. There are several English translations that exist, and each of these translations will have slight variations. But the benefit of a translation is that it tries to capture at least the essence or the main message of what's being conveyed through these words. So both of these translations combined, they kind of give a fairly good idea of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us about Lut alayhi salam and his people. So Lut alayhi salam, he's essentially expressing his displeasure and opposition to their way of life in very clear and unequivocal words. Lut alayhi salam, he's not mincing his words. He's not being politically correct. He's not being PC. Right? He's not censoring what he's saying. Rather, he's extremely clear, he's extremely unequivocal in his denunciation of their behavior, his denunciation of their practices. So he's completely denouncing their way of life and their immoral and corrupt behavior. He asked them, أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ. How can you commit this outrage? How can you commit this obscene act? وَأَنْتُمْ تُبْصِرُونَ, with your eyes wide open. And the outrage being referred to is clarified in the next verse. So Lut alayhi salam, he refers to their behavior as al-fahisha. And then in the next verse, he clarifies what he means by that. إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ. How can you lust after men instead of women? So he's asking his people how in the world they can engage in such behavior when they know that it is completely immoral, depraved, and against the natural order of life. And as we discussed before when we were going through Surah Al-Anbiya, the people of Lut alayhi salam were extremely corrupt, they were evil, they were immoral, and their most evil and wicked deed was engaging in homosexuality. That was the worst, that was the most severe crime that they engaged in. And it's such a horrible and abominable act that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to it as an act of immorality that had never been done before. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses the people of Lut, and He discusses specifically this fahisha, it's described as an act of sin, an act of disobedience, an act of immorality that nobody had previously done in the history of mankind. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مَا سَبَقَكُمْ بِهَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ. And we sent Lut alayhi salam when he said to his people, do you commit such an immorality as no one has preceded you with from among the worlds? Right? مَا سَبَقَكُمْ بِهَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. No community of people had ever engaged in this act before. And what is that act? إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ. Indeed, you approach men with desire instead of women. So it was something that had never been done before in the entire history of mankind. And he ends his statement by reprimanding them. بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ تَجْهَلُونَ. Rather, you are a grossly ignorant people. That you are extremely ignorant of the severity of what you're engaged in. You are extremely ignorant of the consequences of your actions, the consequences of your behavior, and the consequences of your attitude. So in Surah Al-Shu'ara, we were told that he said to his people, أَتَأْتُونَ الذُّكْرَانَ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ وَتَذَرُونَ مَا خَلَقَ لَكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ مِنْ أَزْوَاجِكُمْ بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ عَادُونَ. Must you, unlike other people, lust after males and abandon the wives that God has created for you? You are exceeding all bounds. So once again, Lut alayhi salam, as a prophet, he had genuine care and concern for the salvation of his community. He was sincerely concerned for their safety and well-being. He was sincerely concerned for their salvation. But despite his genuine care and concern, his people responded with opposition and confrontation. Instead of accepting his message and taking his advice, instead of listening to his warning, they threatened to drive him and those who followed him out of their town. فَمَا كَانَ جَوَابَ قَوْمِهِ إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا أَخْرِجُوا آلَ لُوطٍ مِّنْ قَرْيَتِكُمْ إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ. The only answer his people gave was to say, expel Lut alayhi salam's followers from your town. These men mean to stay chaste. Right? فَمَا كَانَ جَوَابَ قَوْمِهِ. The response of his people was nothing إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا, except that they said, أَخْرِجُوا آلَ لُوطٍ مِّنْ قَرْيَتِكُمْ. Expel, excommunicate, kick out the people of Lut from your town. Why? إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ. They are people who are trying to be pure. They are people who are trying to remain chaste. So they responded to his genuine care and concern, his sincere warning, his inviting them towards faith and purity by saying, expel his followers from your town. These people intend to stay chaste. So they decided among themselves to drive Lut alayhi salam and his followers out of their town. And the reason they gave is extremely interesting. Why is it that they are so opposed to Lut alayhi salam and his followers? Why is it that they're deciding to excommunicate him and kick him out of their town? إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ. They are people that intend to be chaste. Meaning they keep themselves pure from our deviant practices and immoral and corrupt behavior. And this is something very, very unique that is highlighted in the Quran. That oftentimes when a society becomes so depraved, when it becomes so immoral, when it becomes so corrupt, when people try to change that, when people try to rectify that, and when people try to bring positive change, they start being seen in a negative light. Right? They try to switch the narrative. And we can draw several parallels from that time to what's going on in today's modern society as well. Right, where this liberal agenda is so strong. Right, the liberal agenda that we have is so strong that this act of immorality, which even here in society was considered immoral and not normal, has completely become something accepted. And has become something so normal that now when a religious community speaks out against it, when a religious person speaks out against this immoral behavior, they are looked at in a negative light. And they are seen to be backwards, they are seen to be illiberal, or they're seen to be repressive and oppressive, and they're seen to be homophobic. And this is a very important point to understand, that being morally against the act of homosexuality does not make one homophobic. This is a false equivalency. Right? Homophobia means you have irrational fear or irrational hatred for a person who chooses to adopt that way of life. And that's not what Islam teaches us. We're not supposed to fear that. We're not supposed to have hatred for the person. We're not supposed to be afraid of him or be prejudiced against the person. What we are supposed to dislike and what we are supposed to hate is the action itself, not the individual. So being morally opposed to something doesn't equate to being homophobic. Right? Just like we are opposed to drinking alcohol. That doesn't make us, alcoholic phobic. Right? We don't hate people who drink alcohol. We hate the fact that they're drinking alcohol. We hate the alcohol itself. And the same thing goes for this type of immoral, indecent behavior. Right? Something that is so depraved. That yes, as believers, as people who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as people who believe in the absolute truth of the Quran, we recognize that this type of behavior is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited. There's absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. That engaging in this behavior is a prohibition. This is something that is not allowed whatsoever within our faith tradition. But we recognize that, we accept that, but that doesn't mean we end up hating the people who are involved in it. Right? That doesn't mean we excommunicate them, that we somehow have this hatred and this this irrational fear or hatred of them. No, that's not what is expected of us. And that's not the attitude that Lut alayhi salam adopted. He lived amongst them, he interacted with them, he dealt with them, and he himself had this genuine concern of trying to change them and correct them and rectify them and remind them about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But again, the dominant, narrative of society made him seem like the bad guy. Right? إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ. These are people who are trying to be pure, they're trying to be chaste. And we see the same thing happening today as well. Where any religious community that speaks out against immoral behavior, immoral practices, or even immodesty, they're automatically termed as being politically incorrect, or they're backwards, or they're repressive, or whatever else it may be. So the reason they gave again is إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ. Now their statement, it ridiculed anyone who sought to keep themselves pure of such a practice. And it also objected to his disapproval of their practice. They were so deep in their deviation that they could not realize how deviant their practice truly was. And their reply also indicated their opposition to the very idea of keeping themselves pure, because that would make them refrain from such perversion. And whatever they meant, they had nonetheless made up their minds to remove Lut alayhi salam from the picture. However, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted something different to happen. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, فَأَنْجَيْنَاهُ وَأَهْلَهُ إِلَّا امْرَأَةً قَدَّرْنَاهَا مِنَ الْغَابِرِينَ. So we saved him and his family. Right? فَأَنْجَيْنَاهُ. We saved Lut alayhi salam, وَأَهْلَهُ, and his family. And what's meant by his family here is that small number of people that decided to follow him. Right? The small number of people that decided to accept his message. إِلَّا امْرَأَةً. Except for his wife. قَدَّرْنَاهَا مِنَ الْغَابِرِينَ. We decreed that she would be among those who stayed behind. Right? Because of her refusal to accept the truth, because of her immorality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed that she would be left behind and be destroyed along with the people of the town. وَأَمْطَرْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ مَطَرًا. And we poured down upon them a rain. فَسَاءَ مَطَرُ الْمُنذَرِينَ. And evil is the rain of those who were warned. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He ends this brief narrative by telling us what happened in the end. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He saved Lut alayhi salam and those people who accept His message and believed, especially those from his family. However, his own wife was not saved. إِلَّا امْرَأَةَ قَدَّرْنَاهَا مِنَ الْغَابِرِينَ. Except for his wife, we decreed that she would be among those who stayed behind. And she wasn't saved because she aided and assisted in the corrupt and immoral behavior of her people. So the reason why she was left behind, the reason why she was included within the punishment of those people, is because she herself aided and assisted in the corrupt, immoral practices and behavior of her people. She didn't object to their way of life, rather she accepted it. So from this, we learn about a very important principle. Right? A very, very important principle within our religion, within our faith, that if something is considered to be evil, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala declares something to be evil, to be sinful, to be immoral and corrupt, then we have to recognize it as something evil, sinful, immoral and corrupt. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam identifies something, an object, an item, or an action, or a behavior as something that is prohibited, something that's evil, something that's immoral, something that's corrupt, then as believers we have to recognize that and acknowledge that. And we have to recognize that as being prohibited and evil and immoral and corrupt as well. That we shouldn't have an ambivalent attitude towards sin. Our attitude towards sin should not be one of ambivalence, that we don't really care. We should not have this lackadaisical attitude towards disobedience. Rather, we should recognize it for what it is and do our best to stay away from it and encourage others to stay away from it as well. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibits something in the Quran, then our responsibility is to try our best to recognize it as being prohibited and then to stay away from it. And not only do we stay away from it ourselves, but we encourage those around us to stay away from it as well. Whether it's our family, whether it's community, whether it's society at large. So our faith and religion, our way of life, is not selfish or individualistic. And this is an extremely important point for us to understand. That according to our faith, according to our religion, Islam is not selfish, it is not individualistic. It's not simply focused on the individual. It is a religion that is built on and around community. Right? Our religion of Islam is built on and around community. Our faith and practice is supposed to have a positive effect on those around us, the community that we are a part of. So our practice of Islam is something that transforms us as individuals, and as it transforms us as individuals, it also transforms our families. It has this positive impact on our community. And if it's not having that positive impact, if it's not transforming our lives, if it's not transforming the lives of those around us, then we are definitely doing something wrong. If our practice of Islam, if our religiosity is not changing us internally, if it's not working to purify our hearts, if it's not changing our character, if it's not changing our behavior, if it's not affecting our speech, if it's not affecting people around us positively, then that means there's something wrong with our practice of Islam. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala summarizes faith for us in the Quran. Right? He tells us very beautifully in Surah al-Asr that وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. That I swear by time, وَالْعَصْرِ, by the declining day or by time, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. Mankind, humanity, is definitely in a state of loss. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts by taking an oath by time, which is one of the most absolute, unique, interesting, and intriguing creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Time is something that, its reality is something we don't truly understand. It's something that all of us experience, it's something that all of us live through. It is the medium of life, but it's this complex creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that none of us truly understand. And it is definitely the most valuable commodity that we possess as human beings. It's more valuable than gold. Right? They say that time is money. This is a common phrase we hear in society. Time is money. But in reality, time is even more valuable than money. Alright, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He takes an oath by time to highlight its value, its significance, its importance. And He also takes an oath by time to emphasize and highlight an absolute truth. Right? Why is it that we swear by things? Why do we say, I swear by God? To emphasize the point we're going to make. To say that we know this with full certainty, that it's the absolute truth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by time to tell us, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ, that mankind, humanity, is definitely, surely, truly in a state of loss. So this is mentioned as a general truth and reality. That we as human beings, each and every single one of us, is in a constant state of loss. Why? Because as we, every breath we take, what's being taken away from our lives? Time. Right? Every moment we're alive, time is constantly being taken away from our lives. Opportunities are constantly being missed. Opportunities for good deeds, opportunities to attain salvation, forgiveness, mercy, it's constantly being lost. So every single human being is in this constant state of loss, except for those who do the following four things. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Except for those who believe, except for those who have faith. They believe in Allah, they believe in the last day, they believe in the Prophet ﷺ. They do good deeds, وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ. And they encourage each other with the truth. Right? They encourage each other, they speak to each other with the truth. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. And they urge and encourage each other to be steadfast and patient. So in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He highlights four qualities, four characteristics that take mankind out of this state of loss. That if we want to stop losing, if we want to become profitable, if we want to start gaining and earning, then we have to possess these four qualities, these four characteristics. The first being إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. The first being Iman, faith. Having this firm certainty in the existence, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having firm certainty in accountability, life after death, reward and punishment, paradise and hell. And having full certainty in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And once we have this faith, it's supposed to translate into action. وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. That our faith expresses itself in the way we behave, the way we do business, the way we interact with each other, the way we speak, the way we do everything in our lives. So our faith translates into good deeds. وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ. And we advise one another with the truth. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. And we advise one another with patience, with steadfastness. From this we can see that our faith and our practice, it's multidimensional. One aspect is very personal. So one aspect of Islam, one aspect of our faith is very, very personal. It is our personal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Focusing on our iman, our faith, our own love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our own personal worship and spiritual growth. Focusing on righteous deeds that will allow us to earn the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and enter paradise. So the first two things that are mentioned that take us out of a state of loss are very personal things. Faith, iman, it's a personal thing. Our good deeds, it's a personal thing. Right? These are things that we do for ourselves. But the other aspect is social, it's communal. Advising each other with the truth and advising each other with patience. Right? وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ. We are constantly reminding each other of the truth. We are constantly reminding each other of what's right and what's wrong, what's moral, what's immoral. We're constantly reminding each other of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and salvation and accountability and the hereafter. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. We are constantly advising each other to remain patient and steadfast. As a matter of fact, it's said that this is one of the defining qualities of our ummah. The most defining quality of the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the fact that we enjoin good and forbid evil. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Ali Imran that كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. That you are the best nation produced as an example for mankind. You enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong and believe in Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us as a sharaf, as an honor. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is praising us as an ummah. That كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. You are the best ummah, you are the best nation that has been produced for all of mankind. Why? تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. Because you benefit society. You advise people, you enjoin what's good. وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. And you prohibit, you prevent what's evil, what's wrong. وَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. And you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this verse is a huge source of honor and dignity for us as Muslims. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is praising us by calling us the best of nations or the best of people. And the reason why we have been given that honor and distinction is because we are supposed to be the most beneficial to others. We are the best of people for the people. Right? We are the best of people for the people. Well, we can only live up to that honor if we're actually following that. If we actually recognize what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to be permissible, and what He says to be impermissible, to be impermissible. And once we know that, we benefit society. Right? We command what's good and we forbid what's evil, and we make society healthy and happy and moral and ethical. Now the reason is because we benefit those around us. Why? Because we forbid what's wrong and we enjoin what is right. So faith and our practice of Islam, again, it is multi-dimensional. And oftentimes our teachers, they would emphasize this point, especially when starting our path or our journey of studying. That they wanted us to recognize the reality of faith, the reality of practice, the reality of deen. That when we say Deenul Islam, when you say the religion of Islam, what exactly are you referring to? Right? When we talk about Islam as a religion, as a way of life, as a complete way of life, what exactly are we talking about? So they would break down Islam into these 5 major components. That our practice of Islam is expressed through these 5 major branches or these 5 major components. So the first and perhaps the most important, they would say, is al-aqaid. Our beliefs, our creed. Because that's what makes us Muslim. That's what makes us believers. So having a firm, deep understanding of our system of belief. That as Muslims, as mu'mins, what do we know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And what do we believe about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What is this concept of at-tawheed? What are His divine names? What are His divine attributes? So having knowledge of Allah that's built upon deep understanding, that's actually built upon knowledge. It's not something that's cultural. It's not something that we inherited from our parents. Rather, it's something that is intellectual. That we know the truth and we accept the truth. So recognizing it, knowing it, and accepting it. So aqaid, that's our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our belief in the angels, our belief in the revealed books, our belief in the prophets and messengers, our belief in the Day of Judgment, and our belief in this concept of qada and qadr, the divine decree, the divine will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? That forms the foundation of belief. And that belief becomes the foundation of every single thing in Islam then. So once we have that belief, we're supposed to express it through al-ibadah, worship. Right? So al-ibadah would be your ritual acts of worship, praying, fasting, zakah, sawm, and hajj. So that's the second aspect of Islam. You have beliefs, then you have ibadah, worship. The third aspect is what they call mu'amala, our financial transactions, our business dealings, buying and selling, leasing, partnerships, whatever else it may be, making sure that our source of income is permissible. The fourth is al-mu'ashara, social dealings. Right? As a human being, again, I play several different roles. I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a cousin, I'm a neighbor, I'm a classmate, I'm a co-worker. And in these different roles that I play in society, what are my responsibilities as well as what are my rights? And the last thing is what they call tazkiyah. Right? Tazkiyah being the spiritual purification of the heart, cleansing our heart from all of these spiritual ailments and spiritual diseases. So our teachers would say that Islam is this holistic way of life. It's this complete way of life that literally covers every single aspect of our lives as human beings. It covers our belief, our creed, our worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our financial transactions, our social interactions, as well as our personal spiritual growth. So it's very important for us to understand that Islam is multi-dimensional, it's not one-directional, it's not limited, it's a very comprehensive code of life. And since it's this comprehensive code of life, it has the ability to transform society around us. It has the ability to transform communities, to transform individuals. And that's why we have been given this honor, the sharaf of being the best of nations. Why تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ? Because we enjoin what's right and we forbid what is wrong. So to bring all this back to the context of the surah, one of the reasons why Lut alayhi salam's wife was among those who were left behind is because she didn't recognize and acknowledge evil as evil. Right? She refused to recognize and acknowledge evil as evil. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He then ends the passage by describing their punishment in a very brief and quick manner. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَأَمْطَرْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ مَطَرًا, and we pour down upon them a rain. فَسَاءَ مَطَرُ الْمُنذَرِينَ, evil is the rain of those who have been warned. So the people of Lut alayhi salam, they were destroyed in a very unique way. They were completely wiped off the face of this earth because of their evil, corruption, immorality, arrogance, pride, stubbornness, and refusal to accept the warnings and advice of their Prophet Lut alayhi salam. And their destruction, it's described in more detail in Surah Hud. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَمَّا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا, and so when what we had ordained came about. فَلَمَّا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا, when our command came, meaning our command to destroy them, جَعَلْنَا عَالِيَهَا سَافِلَهَا, we turned their town upside down. جَعَلْنَا عَالِيَهَا, literally, we made the highest part of the town its lowest part. Meaning we turned them upside down. وَأَمْطَرْنَا عَلَيْهَا حِجَارَةً مِّن سِنْجِيلٍ مَنْضُودٍ, and we rained down stones of baked clay on it. مُسَوَّمَةً عِنْدَ رَبِّكَ, layer upon layer, marked from your Lord. وَمَا هِيَ مِنَ الظَّالِمِينَ بِبَعِيدٍ, it is not far from the evildoers. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually describes their punishment and their destruction in a very detailed and scary manner. جَعَلْنَا عَالِيَهَا سَافِلَهَا, we made the highest part of their town the lowest. We turned them upside down. وَأَمْطَرْنَا عَلَيْهَا حِجَارَةً مِّن سِجِّيلٍ مَنْضُودٍ, and rained down stones of baked clay on it, layer upon layer. مُسَوَّمَةً عِنْدَ رَبِّكَ, marked from your Lord. So they were destroyed in a very severe manner, in a very severe fashion. So from this incident, from this narrative, again, the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions it in several different places throughout the Quran is for us to take lesson from it. Is for us to actually analyze the story, to think about it, to reflect upon it, to contextualize it, to make it relevant to our lives, and then derive lessons and morals and guidance. And one of the most important lessons that can be taken from this is that as people of faith, as people of belief, who believe in Allah and believe in the Prophet ﷺ, we are supposed to have genuine care and concern for other human beings. That regardless of a person's race, culture, ethnicity, religion, regardless of their practices, whether they're sinful or not sinful, whether they're righteous or not righteous, we are supposed to have care and concern for every single human being. That is part of our faith, that's part of our iman. That we should be concerned for the welfare, for the well-being of every single human being. And the most important thing to be concerned for is not only their physical welfare, their financial welfare, but most importantly, their spiritual welfare, their salvation. That we should be concerned as, how can I save my community from being condemned to an eternity of punishment? Right? How can I save my neighbors from going to the hellfire? How can I make them people of belief that can attain salvation? How can I take people with me, inshallah, to Jannah, to paradise? And this was the concern, this was the fiqh of every single prophet and messenger. And this is something that is highlighted very vividly from the story of Lut alayhi salam. I mean, imagine he's living in a town, of a community that is involved in open sin, open disobedience. They are extremely immoral, they're extremely corrupt. But you don't see Lut alayhi salam shunning them. Right? There's no mention that Lut alayhi salam boycotted them, or that Lut alayhi salam shunned them, or that he condemned them, or he cursed them. He still interacted with them, he still had conversations with them, he still lived amongst them, but he would simply warn them. He would remind them about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He would give them these warnings that if you continue engaging in this immoral, this indecent behavior, then you're going to have to face the consequences. And he continues to do so, he continues to do so, continues to do so, until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then tells him, now it's time for you to leave. That these people have become so engrossed in their sin, their immorality, their indecency, that whatever you say is not going to affect them. That whatever you say now is not going to have any effect upon their hearts. So now it's time for their destruction, so you can leave. So we should adopt the same attitude, the same approach. Oftentimes we find, especially in more, quote unquote religious communities, that they have this sense of superiority. We end up thinking that we're better than people. We end up thinking that we're better than others because we have iman and we have faith. Or we think we're better than others because we're in the masjid. Or we think we're better than others because we're not involved in sins that other people are involved in. Right? So for example, if you see, Allah protect us, if you see an alcoholic on the street, or if you see a homeless person and they're homeless because they're addicted to drugs, sometimes we get the sense of arrogance in our hearts that I'm better than this person, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made me better than them. But the reality is, even that person, we should be concerned for them. That yes, we recognize that they did something wrong, they committed an act, they committed something evil, but we don't dislike the person because of it. We still have genuine care and concern for the individual and their salvation. And that is the prophetic model. That is the model embodied by all prophets and messengers, especially the Prophet ﷺ. So in terms of our religion is supposed to have this positive effect on people around us. Right? Another important lesson is that when people become blinded by their immorality, when people become blinded by sin, when they lose their haya, then what's evil becomes good. What is generally recognized as evil and immoral starts being recognized as something that's good and normal. And unfortunately, we live in an era where we are seeing this happen right before our eyes. That things that have normally been considered indecent, immoral, unethical are now celebrated. And it's actually part of pop culture, it's part of the mainstream media to celebrate this type of behavior. And we have the ultimate example of that, unfortunately, in our 45th president. Right? Someone who's involved in such indecent behavior, someone who's involved in, straight up lying and unethical practices. He's the president of the United States, and whatever he says, it's overlooked. Whatever he's done, it's overlooked. And we are living in a time and an age where these things are becoming normalized. So as people of faith, as people of iman, we shouldn't become desensitized to these things. That whatever is evil should be recognized as evil, and we should try our best to work towards changing it. Right? There's this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he mentions different levels of bringing change. Right? مَنْ رَأَى مِنْكُمْ مُنْكَرًا فَلْيُغَيِّرْهُ بِيَدِهِ. That whoever amongst you sees an evil, munkar, then they should change it with their hands. They should change it physically. So a munkar is the opposite of ma'ruf. Ma'ruf is anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet ﷺ have encouraged and declared to be good, to be wholesome, to be pure, to be an act of righteousness. That's ma'ruf. Munkar is the exact opposite. Munkar is something that's evil, something that's wrong, something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet ﷺ declared to be evil and wrong and act of disobedience. So we are being told, مَنْ رَأَى مِنْكُمْ مُنْكَرًا. Whoever amongst you sees an evil, فَلْيُغَيِّرْهُ بِيَدِهِ. Then they should try to change it physically with their hands. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. If they're unable to change it physically with their hands, then they should change it with their tongues. They should speak out against it. They should protest against it. They should educate people regarding it. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِقَلْبِهِ. If a person is unable to do things verbally with their tongues, then at least in their heart, at least deep down inside, they should recognize evil as evil. وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ. And that is the weakest level of faith. So according to our personal circumstances, in our own spheres of authority, we can fall into any of these three categories. Right? There may be some instances, there may be some spheres where we're able to do things physically. We can actually change things physically. So for example, within the sphere of our own homes, if we see something wrong, if we see something, inappropriate, we can change it physically. We have the authority to do so. But if it's out in society and we don't have that jurisdiction, then we should at least speak up against it. And alhamdulillah, here in America, we have freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want to whoever you want. It should be done, of course, with hikmah, right? أُدْعُوا إِلَى سَبِيلِ رَبِّكَ بِالْحِكْمَةِ وَالْمَوْعِظَةِ حَسَنَةِ. That call towards the way of your Lord with wisdom, with good words, with good reminders. So we should say things and we should speak up. They say that أفضل الجهاد كلمة حق عند سلطان جائر. That the best form of jihad, the best form of struggling in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to speak the truth in front of an oppressive ruler. It's to speak the truth in front of a tyrant. So speaking truth to power. That is one of the best forms of striving in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's babilisani. That if we see something wrong, we see something evil, as a religious community we should have a voice. And we should voice our concerns. We should make it known that as people of faith, as religion, we recognize this to be evil and immoral and destructive for society. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ If a time ever comes where we're unable to do that, فَبِقَلْبِ That at least in our hearts we recognize it as evil. وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ And that is the weakest of faith. And here there's many other lessons that can be learned and derived that would take contemplation, reflection. And that's part of why we read the Quran and engage with the Quran. That there are lessons, there are morals, there are things that according to our own understanding and our personal circumstances, that we can derive through tadabbur, by reflecting and pondering deeply over these verses, and by relating it perhaps to our current social context and political context and whatever else it may be. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inshallah to give all of us the tawfiq, the ability to do so. To not only recite the Quran but try our best to understand it, and most importantly implement it into our daily lives. So before we end for tonight, are there any questions?
On one hand, God admonishes everything in Islam, do this, do that. On the other hand, in the nature, why there are so many faults? People are born with bisexual, or they cannot determine their sex, which way to go, man or woman. Why it is so?
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's not bound by our understandings of what's fair and what's just. Right? Whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is absolute justice and fairness. And whatever He creates people as, that's their challenge. That could be their challenge in life, that could be their test in life. And every single human being is going to be tested, but they're going to be tested in different ways. Every human being is definitely going to be tested, but the test is going to take different forms in different ways. And for each person, that their responsibility is to try their best to adhere to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them. So for example, this issue of homosexuality particularly, specifically, since it's such a hot topic and it's discussed so much and we're exposed to it so much, it's important to understand what our proper approach to it should be. That for a long time in the Muslim community, the verbiage and the language and the rhetoric that's been used has been extremely harsh. And oftentimes the rhetoric is so harsh that it turns people off and it turns people away. Because there may be sincere Muslims, right? There may be sincere practicing Muslims who are actually struggling with this. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. That there could actually be Muslims amongst our community who come and pray with us and mingle with us and meet with us, that they're struggling with this desire, they're struggling with this attraction. So it's important to recognize that within Islam, feelings and thoughts are things that we are not held accountable for. If there's some natural feeling, if there's some natural thought in our mind, we are not held accountable for that, and that's from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What we are responsible for doing, what we are mukallaf of doing, is now controlling those thoughts and desires so that they don't become actions. Right? We are not allowed to act upon those feelings or those desires. So for example, somebody might be a kleptomaniac. They have this urge to constantly do what? Steal things. Right? So they might have that urge, they might have that feeling, and they won't be held accountable for it. They'll be held accountable if they actually go in, steal. And that's their struggle in life, and that's their challenge, that's their test, that they have to learn how to control that desire, to control that want. Right? So this is something that we should recognize, that when it comes to this issue in particular, that there may be people who are struggling with this. It might be an actual, genuine struggle that they have. And if they recognize that as a struggle and that's their test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're trying their best to stay away from it, they're trying to best to avoid it, we shouldn't shun them, we shouldn't reprimand them, we shouldn't scold them. Rather, we should make them feel comfortable, feel safe, and help and assist them. That's our duty as a community, is to help them and assist them with this challenge. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't hold them accountable for those feelings, but they should not act out upon it. And if they happen to act out upon it, Allah protect us and protect them. If they do so, then the doors of tawbah, the doors of forgiveness are always open. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's door of repentance is open till the last moment of a person's life. Hatta yughargir. Until the last moments of a dying person's life, the door of tawbah is always open. And we should never condemn people because of what they've done in the past. Because there could be someone who's extremely evil, and in the end of their life they become extremely righteous. And that's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ as well, where he tells us that, there might be a person, their entire lives, they spent it in good. Their entire lives, they spent it doing good deeds and righteous deeds, so much so that the distance between that person in Jannah is only one handspan. There's only one handspan between that person in paradise, and then they do something at the end of their lives that causes them to go directly to hellfire. And there could be someone that their entire lives, they spent it in sin, in disobedience, and there's only a handspan between them and Jahannam and hellfire, but at the end of their lives, they do something that causes them to become the people of paradise. And they say it's from the infinite mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that second scenario is more common. That you see this happening. That people might spend their lives in disobedience and sin, and then all of a sudden at the end of their lives they change, and they become people of paradise. Whereas the first scenario is less common. It's not very often that you see someone who's righteous that all of a sudden becomes evil. That doesn't really happen. But the opposite does. And there's several instances of this where a person might have spent their entire life on disbelief, and on their deathbed they become Muslim. They accept Islam.
Another question that leads to another question. How will they live their life? For example, if somebody says, I'm not attracted towards the woman, I'm not attracted towards the man, and God has made me like that, this is genetic fault, God has made me like that, what is my fault? So I have to live that kind of life, but God has ordained me.
It will be their struggle in life, right? That's something that's a challenge that they have to figure out on how to deal with it and cope with it. There's this feeling that they're not going to be acted upon. Just like for all of us, there's certain restrictions that we might be inclined towards it, but we can't do it because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said not to. Right? And that's why, for example, I don't know, maybe alcohol. Maybe someone's really, really, heavily attracted towards alcohol. And that's the struggle now. They can't drink it. Because that's the bound set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what we stick to. That's what we adhere to. Because we acknowledge that He is the all-knowing, the almighty, the all-wise. And He knows best what's best for us. So we have to end up sticking to that.
How do you be like, let's say we see what is place or school or what, if they are oppressed by other people or government, what will be our reaction? How do we symbolize this? How do we do this? Because we don't like the action.
Yeah. So that is a very, very, how do you say this? That's a very nuanced discussion. Right? Because you can't come out in support of their immoral behavior, but you can come out in support of them deserving the normal rights of every single human being. To be treated with respect and kindness and generosity, and to be given their rights. So it's a very balanced, nuanced thing that you can support them in terms of, like, if you see them being picked on, if you see someone cussing at them, if you see something like that, you can stick up for them, but you don't stick up for their immoral behavior. So it becomes a very fine, delicate balance. All right. So for example, perhaps going and joining a rally for LGBTQ rights may not be permissible, right? Because you're supporting their lifestyle then. But supporting them in terms of if they were being oppressed, right? If they weren't being given their rights, if they were being harassed or physically beaten, and you go out in support of that, that would be a different story. No. Go on. Why did?
Why Lut, Prophet Lut and Noah, they stayed with the wife, with evil,
Yeah.
and they had choice to get better wife, who could be better for us. Spreading the message about
Maybe that's a lesson for us that you should try everything possible to fix your marriage. Allahu A'lam. I don't know. Maybe they express their disbelief in the end, or they express their stubbornness in the end. Allahu A'lam. But it's just to show that, one of the wisdoms behind that is to show that lineage and relationships do not benefit a person. It's a person's own what? Own belief, their own actions. Just because you're related to someone, you're from a particular family, doesn't mean you're safe. And it's a huge lesson for us as well that we might be practicing and we might have genuine concern and we may be the best of people, but at the end of the day, hidayah lies in whose hands? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there could be instances where there's extremely righteous people, but their children have gone astray. And they've tried their best, they've given their best effort, but at the end of the day, hidayah is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
then you can stay out of him, right? And what would be the consequence for these on the day of judgment?
There won't be any consequences for it. It's just varying levels because it depends on a person's authority. So if a person commits a crime, the only way they can be held accountable for it is if there's actually authority in place, where there's a legal system and it goes through the legal process and the state carries out the punishment. Right? Individuals can't carry out punishments. It has to be done by the state. So if that system is not in place, then you can speak out against it, you can dislike it in your heart, but you won't be held accountable for that.
In Hadith, one Hadith, we found that the punishment should be on the day of judgment both. As I cannot take many things, him and me should the same punishment on the day of judgment.
No, if you still dislike it in your heart, you won't be held accountable for it because you recognize it to be wrong, and you did what's in your ability. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah doesn't hold a person accountable for what's beyond their capability, what's beyond their ability. So if you find yourself in a situation where you can only dislike it in your heart, you're not responsible for anything else beyond that. No. Mm-hmm.
But she did not go to that.
That's what they say. Yeah. She just allowed it to happen, aided it, assisted it. Alright, so we'll continue next week with the verse number 59, inshallah. So may Allah accept this from us, place on our scale of good deeds on the day of judgment. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanakallah bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. جزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.